Just to introduce myself a little bit and how I arrived here. I started working in an auto plant in Southern Ontario at 19 years old. So about 14 years ago. Became active in the union a little bit less than a year after starting in the plant. And I had never finished high school before I went into the plant, and was reading a lot of books once I started making cars. You know, you have a rhythm with the assembly line, you read a couple of sentences, you go back to making cars, you go back and forth, right? And you're doing that for 10 hours a day for multiple years, you end up reading a lot of books. And in the context of getting involved in the union, you start reading more radical books, and you start trying to figure out why is production organized in this way? Because it doesn't make sense when you walk into a place like that, right? So you try to educate yourself on the history, and part of that education is reading, part of it is getting more active in the union. I started taking some courses at university a couple of years into the plant and ended up completing a 4-year labor studies degree at McMaster in Hamilton. That's a fabulous program. If anyone has a chance to hang out with those guys, do it. I did a 1-year master's degree at McMaster after that, and the master's degree that I wrote, the paper that I wrote for that degree at McMaster was about competition in the auto industry. When I finished that degree, I heard about the pilot year of a program that had just gotten started in Germany. This was in 2004, 2005. It's called the Global Labor University. If anybody wants to talk about that afterwards, we should, because it's a program that's open for trade unionists. I was there for the pilot year. They're up and running now in several countries. And the idea was, the ILO was at the center of the organizing body for this Global Labor University. It's a 1-year master's degree, and people from trade unions take a year out of their work and go spend a year with other trade unionists. So for me, there was 23 of us from 18 different countries. And it really gives you build trust with people when you're in a similar situation, and we're all out of our homes and away from our families for the most part. My family, I was lucky enough. My little one was born just before we left, so the 3 of us went together. But it's a fabulous program that people should really popularize and check out. There's been a few Canadians that have gone. I came back from that year away and continued making cars for another 1.5 years. Continued being active in the union, not only in strike support activism kind of stuff, direct action kind of stuff, but also teaching and writing courses for, mostly for auto workers, but also, I live in Hamilton, so also for the local labor council there. I was one of the people who took the voluntary buyouts, so the permanent separation from the company. I did that about 1.5 years ago. And then just in January started a full-time research position with Service Employees International Union, SEIU, Local 1, which is the health side of the union. So what I'm working on right now is working on the research side of an organizing campaign for home care workers. And in fact, there's a lot of overlap with the Filipino brothers, what they're saying in terms of the labor market locally, because there's many workers who come into Canada in that program that end up working in these personal support worker kind of roles in the health sector. So there's a lot of overlaps there. My story actually, the reason Pablo invited me, I gave Pablo the short version of a story that happened in Oakville. The consequences of that story are still happening, but the main story happened a few years ago. And it's a story about workers being put into direct competition for jobs. Workers in 3 different countries being blackmailed for jobs. And the story that I have to relate is about the risks of accepting a closed-minded strategy when it comes to being put into that kind of competition. In order to do that, I think it makes sense just to do a brief history of the auto sector, just in broad terms, so people kind of understand the consequences of some of the recent changes for that. But I'll be brief about that stuff. The plant in Oakville was set up in the 1950s, and the reason the Ford Motor Company set that plant up was to run away from the union in Windsor, because the union was successful in organizing in that area. So the company thought, well, let's go where there's nothing, right? Let's go into a rural area, hire a bunch of farmers, right? It's the same thing Toyota did in Cambridge or Honda did in Alliston, right? They set up these plants in areas outside of the big cities where people don't have a culture of organizing in trade unions, right? Of course, these guys were unsuccessful, right, in running away from the union. The plant was almost immediately organized. That was the main plant that was built in Oakville. In the 1960s, there's a growth, right? There's a growth, broadly speaking, in terms of mass consumption, mass production, and they also set up a truck plant in Oakville. So there's 2 plants there since the 1960s. And these plants were set up in the traditional way, which was to have 3 shifts of production running 24 hours, pumping out the exact same product. So just bang, bang, bang. Mass production in that classic kind of way that we think about it. And of course, that it becomes increasingly obvious to everybody that that is unsustainable. Look into the 1970s, this is like 1950s, 1960s when this massive growth happens, right? Into the 1970s, we see what gets called lean production. There's increased competition in the sector, and so the companies look for lots of ways to reorganize work, introduce teamwork, all that kind of stuff, try to change how they make cars, right? And there's a work intensification that happens around the same time. Following immediately after that, you start to see the evolution of the free trade agreements and the integration of the markets, particularly for North America, right? First just US-Canada, then US-Canada-Mexico into the free trade agreements. And this logic of competition for jobs gains traction with workers and with unions as the markets get integrated, right? The risk of capital flight becomes more and more real. And companies are using that more and more commonly, right? They're saying, well, you're in competition for jobs, right? And the reality of the threat is a difficult one to call the employer on, right? To what extent is it true? Well, it's rarely true that it's even possible for them to do it, but it's a convincing argument for lots of reasons. What happens on the trade union side in that context is the erosion of an independence from the company. So more and more what the union ends up doing is adopting, accepting and then adopting the same kind of logic that the company's using, which is to say, the company's saying you're in competition for jobs, well the union's not denying that you're in competition for jobs, and the union's saying, well the company said you're in competition for jobs, here's their list of demands, we're delivering them to you. We did our best, but here is their list of demands, right? So there's no longer an independent perspective from a worker's perspective. This is growing rapidly at the same time into the 1990s and early into the mid-90s when we're seeing the global social justice movement growing. And we see in Southern Ontario, at least, the growth of what were called the flying squads. Has anybody ever heard of those guys? No? Mid-90s and then close to 2000. There was a quite strong decentralized network of labor movement left activists doing strike support. And it was like, this is, as I was getting radicalized, I was born kind of into that movement as it was growing. And it was really incredible. Like, workers in many different workplaces in many different sectors talking to each other and mobilizing at a moment's notice, and also mobilizing for things like the Quebec City Free Trade Agreement talks, like the Free Trade Area of the Americas, right? Mobilizing for those kinds of things, but also mobilizing in a very direct way, and then starting to do things like what you guys are doing in terms of education, in terms of talking to each other and building our analytical skills. There was a lot of that kind of work that was connected to it. So the next step in terms of the chronology is that the intensification of work and the rationalization of production has accelerated into the 1990s and then close to 2000. And the Ford Motor Company has announced that it's going to close that truck plant in Oakville. And this truck plant has been an award-winning plant for the Ford Motor Company and their chain. It has some of the best product, some of the best quality numbers, right? The workers there are totally indignant in their response. They're saying this is a total injustice. It doesn't make any sense. What kind of people are running a company where their award-winning plant, they are calling it the jewel in the crown, right? And they're saying they have this plant, it's the same argument you saw with Oshawa and GM a couple of years later, right? When in terms of the quality awards and all this kind of stuff. And in terms of cost of production, they're low relatively, right? And the response on the union side to the closure of that truck plant was a weak response. It was to organize, the biggest substantive event that the union organized was a weekend rally in the parking lot of the plant, which a few hundred people showed up to, and the response was, it was particularly weak because there wasn't any kind of broader analysis of why this was happening. The union, the Auto Workers Union in particular, has some excellent education when it comes to globalization and anti-capitalism, when it comes to racism and anti-racism. But when it comes to the actual nuts and bolts and the work of the union, this is when those kinds of, the groundwork that's been laid in those kinds of educationals, this is when you need that stuff to be brought forward. We need a really good analysis of why this kind of stuff is happening. And we need to reject the logic of competition. And that's not what happened. What happened was, as I said, an indignant response, like an injustice. How could they possibly close this plant? And it had the weekend rally, and shortly after that, we were presented with the company's list of demands. And they said, well, there's no chance we're gonna keep that plant open, but by the way, we have this list of demands for the upcoming round of negotiations, right? And so the union, in negotiations with the company, then delivered that list of demands. And at the same time that happened, the president, the local president of that Oakville plant, the union, was hired by the national office of the union, bumping the vice president who was an articulate radical, into the president's office. And that guy was now put in the position where he has to sell the concessions. And he did an extremely effective job, and almost immediately got hired on at the national office after those concessions were voted on.